In 1967, the U.S. Army handed Johnny Gupton an M16 and shipped him into a jungle on the other side of the world. There was just one detail the recruiters glossed over. Gupton couldn't read a map, he couldn't write his own name, and he had never even heard the word Vietnam before stepping foot in it. When his fellow soldiers asked the brass how someone with his cognitive limitations had slipped past the draft board, the answer was treated like standard operating procedure. He was one of McNamara's morons. By 1966, the military was bleeding through personnel. The war was expanding rapidly, and draft calls had surged for 15 straight months, hitting numbers the Pentagon hadn't seen since Korea. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara was staring down a severe manpower deficit. Washington faced a political trap that demanded a cold calculation of whose lives were expendable enough to hold the line. The most mathematically obvious way to close that gap was to eliminate draft deferments for college students. But that single rule shielded a highly specific slice of America. Sending the sons of wealthier, well-connected families into the jungle meant drafting from the very demographic that held the loudest political voice. President Lyndon Johnson and McNamara refused to touch those educational deferments. Expanding the draft onto privileged doorsteps was viewed as immediate political suicide. Instead, the Department of Defense launched an alternative strategy called Project 100,000. To protect the middle class, the government artificially engineered a massive new pool of acceptable casualties by entirely rewriting the definition of who was fit to serve. Publicly, lowering the military's mental and physical enlistment standards was pitched as an act of generosity. Officials sold it as a natural extension of the Great Society welfare programs, a path out of poverty for disadvantaged young men. Labor Secretary Daniel Moynihan even described the armed forces as, quote, a socializing experience for the poor. The reality on the ground was starkly different. The program swept in over 300,000 men who had previously been rejected. All of them scored below 91 on military IQ tests, and nearly half scored below 71. Many were functionally illiterate or had severe physical limitations, like partial blindness. Basic training immediately exposed the danger of this policy. Drill instructors suddenly found themselves managing recruits who couldn't tie their own boots, couldn't follow multi-step instructions, or couldn't reliably distinguish their left from their right. Inside the ranks, these men had their files marked with large red stamps to indicate their special status. That visibility made them easy targets for severe bullying, with some subjected to elaborate humiliation rituals by their own platoons. Washington had successfully packaged the induction of intellectually disabled men into an active war zone as progressive, humanitarian uplift. But a combat zone does not adjust its lethal risks to accommodate a soldier's cognitive limits. Under intense pressure to complete missions with the bodies they had, commanding officers frequently put these specific recruits in the most exposed positions. They were regularly ordered to walk point, the absolute front of a jungle patrol, the first to trip a wire or draw sniper fire. This created a lethal chain reaction. Handing the lead position to someone unable to read a warning sign or process a verbal command endangered that individual and every soldier following in his footsteps. We can see how this mathematical arrangement played out on the battlefield. This chart shows the baseline mortality rate for standard American troops in Vietnam. Now compare that to Project 100,000 inductees, who died at 3 times the rate of the soldiers fighting beside them. General William Westmoreland, who commanded the entire American war effort in Vietnam, would later assess the program in his own words as a complete disaster. For the thousands of Project 100,000 recruits who managed to survive the jungle, the punishment continued long after they turned in their rifles. Because they struggled to navigate military bureaucracy, many went AWOL or committed minor offenses, just trying to cope with the strain. The military responded by issuing a disproportionate number of less than honorable discharges, which immediately stripped these veterans of the exact support benefits they needed to reintegrate into civilian life. Decades of outcome data show the result. Compared to civilian men with similar cognitive profiles who never served, Project 100,000 veterans went on to have consistently lower incomes and much higher rates of divorce. Ultimately, the program forced these men into significantly worse life outcomes than the peers who never served. Despite this devastating paper trail, Robert McNamara never issued an apology. In fact, in his later memoirs, he continued to defend the project as a success. Some historians do note that a fraction of these men found structure and useful skills during their service, but a 300% increase in mortality is a very difficult number to argue with. Project 100,000 exposes the brutal arithmetic of privilege. When a nation refuses to ask its elite to bleed, the manpower deficit is paid by those least equipped to survive the debt.